Firstly, I just wanted to talk about how the war is going in general. So I've been very hesitant, um, at least since last winter, to offer any kind of timelines of when I thought things would happen. Like, I was very hesitant to say that this war was going to end at a specified time, that X was going to happen or Y was going to happen, or we're in like the end game. I tried very hard to keep it to relative, like if something's going well for one side or something's going poor for another side. And I even called it Schrodinger's war. The last time I made a time prediction was I thought that Russia's war effort was going to collapse if they didn't succeed in a large offensive by the end of last winter. Now, that obviously wasn't the case, and I was 100% wrong about that. But since then, I've been very reluctant to give any kind of time estimates. I'm going to give you some now, and we'll see if I'm right or wrong. I personally initially thought before the October thing that this war was going to end in about the summer of 2025 is when I thought that this would be concluded by. That's when I thought that this would probably have been over by. Now I'm moving it up, so I think because of the Israel situation, I think by the end of the year, Avdiivka will fall, and I think we might actually be entering the end phase now. Assuming Russia launches a winter offensive, which it looks like they're in the early phases of, I expect they will be in serious negotiations by the summer. Is kind of where I am now. I don't know. I kind of doubt that the Ukrainian army is just going to collapse altogether. But given current trends, given where things are at the moment, my guess would be they will start negotiating on unfavorable terms sometime before summer of next year. Simply put, Ukraine went through the last of its strategic reserves in the big counteroffensive without achieving anything. I think Ukraine has, yes, they got a couple spots, but they have no way of exploiting that. They burned through the remaining strategic reserves. I don't think they have the ability to launch major offensives anymore. We still see some infiltration by infantry squads, and they can occasionally grab some territory. But I really don't think they can do another major offensive at this point in time. Unless they're just going to go back to scraping the bottom of the barrel and getting whatever the last couple tanks they have left. If they do another offensive, though, I think they won't even have the ability to defend themselves at that point in time. So, I think we are heading into the death spiral, as it were. And I think that's largely based on the fact that American money isn't coming. So we discussed this in a previous video where I determined that the US basically provides, I think it's something like the entire Ukrainian state budget. It was between half and all of it. So Ukraine has just kind of lost. The numbers are not exact in my head, but roughly we'll say the Ukrainian state has lost about 50% of its income, given the current crisis in Washington. Who knows whether or not they will actually be able to get any kind of funding done. I haven't heard the latest news. If anybody's heard anything about if there's a deal with Biden over Ukraine funding and the what's going on in the border wall, let me know. But from my understanding, it's not going anywhere at the moment. By the time it does get reauthorized, we're going to be months behind schedule, and that aid is going to be however long it took. The aid is going to if it's delayed like 3 months, that means they'll start sending the aid 3 months late. It doesn't mean like the day they get the bill passed is gonna be sent there. It means that's when they start sending it. Unless Biden already has it working or they figured out some other way to give them weapons, which they did with the ATACMS, but there's that. There's also basically Ukraine was out of reserves of a lot of stuff, most notably artillery shells, and they're more or less relying on what the U.S. and Europe can provide them on a monthly basis. Now, a lot of that is now going to Israel. The thing is, Ukraine was never going to completely run out of money, ammunition, I should say. The idea was that they were going to continue to get a trickle of it from the West, but that they wouldn't have the amount of artillery they needed. Like during the counteroffensive, there were times when they were firing more shells than the Russians, particularly on a local level, because they just went through their entire reserves. But let's go through this because we have some pretty shocking admissions that we're going to discuss. This is just kind of a warm up, but we have like one of the most doomer things I've ever seen from the Wall Street Journal and the I forget what it's called. We'll look at it. Spectator, I think. Okay, so this is our warm up article. Imagine there may be no help. Conclusions of U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine. Penny Pritzker, aka Penny Pincher, U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine's recovery, has suggested that officials imagine how Ukraine could survive economically without U.S. aid during her first visit to Ukraine. Yeah, that's not a good sign. That's not what you want to have happen. You don't want on your first trip there them to say that. Pritzky Pincher met with President Vladimir Zelensky, the Prime Minister and government officials, the chair of the Parliament and American business. In addition, she even attended a Congress of regional authorities together with whoever head of the president's office. Okay, so let's see here. Penny tried to get people to think like, let's imagine there is no American aid. What do you need to do over the next year to make sure your economy can survive even in this situation? And it stressed everybody out. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being paranoid or I'm looking at things that aren't there. I think that's pretty scary if that's like one of the first things she's saying. It's inaccurate to say she had messages like there won't be any support. She said, imagine there isn't any support. That's very different. So that is kind of the warm up, and that is the attitude that they're taking. So we are going to start off with I could not find the Wall Street Journal version of this article is behind a paywall, and I couldn't figure out how to get past the paywall. So we're going to read the version of the article that's here. So this is from the Wall Street Journal. It's time to end magical thinking about Russia's defeat, which is not a good sign, especially when you have this, like, Putin giving a smug Pepe face. As Russian President Vladimir Putin looks towards the second anniversary of his all-out assault on Ukraine, his self-confidence is hard to miss. A much-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive has not achieved the breakthrough that would give Kiev a strong hand to negotiate. Now, we're going to go through this very carefully because there's a lot to dissect here. Now, we noticed negotiation has started to be used. I'm not sure if everyone recalls, but for the longest time, we were told there would be no negotiation. There would be no agreement with Russia. We still have the Zelensky formula, I think it is, that negotiations cannot start until Russia pulls out from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. But this article is already kind of saying negotiation is a given at this point in time. They're also admitting that the counteroffensive failed, which is something I have not been seeing too much of. They've said it didn't live up to expectations, but they haven't said it's failed. Tumult in the Middle East dominates the headlines, and bipartisan support for Ukraine in the U.S. has been upended by polarization and dysfunction in Congress, not to mention the pro-Putin leanings of Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump. Putin has reason to believe that time is on his side. At the front line, there are no indications that Russia is losing what has become a war of attrition. So we have a lot of big things to unpack in that sense. Putin has reason to believe he has time on his side. We were told for the longest time that the sanctions were going to destroy Russia's economy, and they refute that later in this article. They say the sanctions didn't work, but we were told America was gearing up. We're going to be outproducing Russia by 2025. We have all these other weapons. We're the new arsenal of democracy. We're just going to keep building it up. We have the F-16s are coming and all the other stuff. But now they're just saying, yeah, time's on Putin's side. At the front line, there are no indications that Russia is losing, which is kind of a backhanded compliment. It's saying, okay, well, there's not indications they're winning, but there's no indications that they're losing. I guess. And they're admitting it's a war of attrition. Because for the longest time, they were saying that this was a war of territorial conquest, that whoever was taking and holding the most ground was the victor. And they were using that as a way to say Ukraine was actually winning the war because Ukraine had retaken all that ground in their offensive last year. But it's clearly not the case anymore. The Russian economy has been buffeted, but it is not in tatters. That's a big admission, because I don't know if you all remember, like Russia was buying washing machines to take the chips out of washing machines was the narrative that we were sold for a while. That like Russia couldn't produce any of this stuff domestically, that it was going to destroy Russia's economy. And personally, I thought it was. I actually thought that the sanctions were going to have a much bigger effect than they did. I thought that Russia was dependent upon certain high-tech goods that it didn't manufacture, and without them, it would be devastating to their economy. But it seems like through a combination of increased domestic production, trading with non-embargo countries, and getting around the sanctions by trading through third parties like Kazakhstan or Turkey, they're managing to get past the sanctions, and it hasn't severely hurt their economy. At least in the way that we thought. Putin's hold on power was paradoxically strengthened following Prigozhin's failed rebellion in June. Popular support for the war remains solid, and elite backing of Putin has not fractured. Yeah, and I said this at the time. Putin, not a single person supported Prigozhin. I think one officer in Wagner supported him. All the territorial governors, all the officials, all the military personnel sided with Putin during that almost immediately. The whole thing just kind of collapsed from lack of public support. So while it was deeply embarrassing and humiliating for Putin, I think it ended just about as bad as it could have. As good as it could have, given a coup attempt. That whole thing was a disaster, and I still have no idea what happened, whether that was a coup, whether that was a march for justice, whether Prigozhin thought he was going to become like the new shogun, or what. But I don't know. Western officials' promises of reinvigorating their own defense industries have collided with bureaucratic and supply chain bottlenecks. Meanwhile, sanctions and export controls have impeded Putin's war effort far less than expected. Russian defense factories are ramping up their output, and Soviet legacy factories are outperforming Western factories when it comes to much-needed items like artillery shells. My understanding is they're also buying a substantial number of them from North Korea now. And once again, people can make fun of them from buying something from North Korea, because North Korea is kind of a joke of a country in a lot of ways. But, is there any scenario where you want less artillery shells? If you can have more artillery shells, then why not? Like if you're producing, 2 million a month, and you can buy another 100,000 from North Korea. Well, that's more you can fire. So why wouldn't you buy them? The technocrats responsible for running the Russian economy have proven themselves to be resilient, adaptable, and resourceful. Elevated oil prices, driven in part by close cooperation with Saudi Arabia, are refilling state coffers. Ukraine, by contrast, depends heavily on infusions of Western cash. Well, Ukraine has no economy other than basically foreign aid at this point. There's the grain deal didn't wind up going anywhere, so that's just not a thing. Putin can also look at his foreign policy record with satisfaction. His investments in key relationships have paid off. China and India have provided an important backstop for the Russian economy by ramping up imports of Russian oil and other commodities, instead of fretting about lost markets in Western Europe or Beijing's reluctance to flout US and EU sanctions. Putin has decided it's more advantageous in the short term simply to become China's junior partner in the economic realm, which is probably true. To be honest, it probably is. But you know what? The Russian economy didn't collapse. They're gradually producing stuff there that they used to import from the West. So I guess if the choice was hopefully temporarily let China grab you by the balls, who knows where this is going to go? Russia seems pretty determined to rebuild its economy and to not have to be less reliant on outside powers. But I mean, it's true. Like, rather than crying about the sanctions from Western Europe, they just immediately just tried to go and trade elsewhere and went to other people and just sold their stuff other places. They took decisive action, and it looks like it largely paid off. Even neighboring countries that have every reason to fear Putin's aggressive tactics, such as Armenia, why does Armenia have to fear Russia's tactics? Armenia was an ally of Russia. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan have made fat profits by serving as enablers of sanctions, circumvention, and as transshipment points for goods that Russia used to import directly. Is that spelt right? There's not a hyphen or a space or something there? Despite Putin's indictment by the International Criminal Court and the abundant evidence of Russian state-sponsored war crimes in Ukraine, or should we say Israel war crimes in Palestine, he is still embraced in various parts of the so-called global south. The Ukraine war holds little salience for many countries who bristle at what they perceive as US and European double standards or a lack of engagement on issues that concern them. I mean, a lot of them just don't really care. Also, it's kind of hard to do this narrative, especially now with Israel carpet bombing Gaza. Like, they have probably killed more civilians at this point than Russia has in Ukraine. Just going off of extrapolating from where the estimates were a week or two ago. The main thrust of the let's see here. Putin signed off. I'm just trying to see here. Putin does not feel any pressure to end the war or worry about his ability to sustain it more or less indefinitely. As winter approaches, the Russian army has mounted a limited ground offensive of its own and surely will expand missile and drone attacks in Ukrainian cities, power plants, industrial sites, and other critical infrastructure. See, for the last year or so, particularly last winter, they've been trying to get rid of Ukraine's air defenses. So the theory was that they were hitting all the power plants last year because the idea they were attacking static targets that Ukraine would have to use interceptor missiles against as a way of basically just forcing them to get them down. At a minimum, Putin expects that US and European support for Ukraine will dissipate, that Ukrainians will tire of the endless terror and destruction inflicted on them, and that a combination of the two will enable him to dictate terms for a deal to end the war and claim victory. From his perspective, the ideal person to put such a deal together is Donald Trump if he returns to the White House in 2024, which is certainly a possibility at this point in time. The Russian leader is prepared to weaponize everything at its disposal to win the war in Ukraine. Nuclear arms control and European security are now hostage to Russia's insistence on the West ending its support for Ukraine. I mean, to be fair, they their insistence to do any business with Russia is dependent upon it ending its war in Ukraine. So, true enough. I do agree, though, that the ending of the arms reduction treaties is scary. I did think that was, I forget who it was, if it was Nixon or Ford or Reagan who really got the arms limitation treaties going. But that does scare me that we're not reducing the number of nuclear weapons anymore, and that whole thing just kind of failed. Let's see here. Taken together, this state of affairs poses an unprecedented challenge for Western leaders. Washington and its allies have been remarkably effective at tackling the most urgent problems of the situation, staving off Ukraine's collapse, keeping it well supplied. That is not true. With advanced weapons and real-time advanced intelligence, that is true, and devising sanctions against Russia, which they've already admitted didn't work. But now is the time to transition to a long-term strategy that increases and sustains the pressure on the rogue regime in the Kremlin. There should be no illusions that any possible combination of short-term steps will be sufficient to force Putin to abandon his war. I mean, isn't that kind of a admission of defeat at this point in time? I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like to me. I mean, they're basically stating that there's really nothing they can do at this point. What Western leaders conspicuously haven't done is level with their publics about the enduring nature of the threat from an emboldened revisionist Russia. Now, I don't know if they misspelled that, if they mean revanchist Russia. I don't really know why revisionist would be the term. I think it would be revanchist or resurgent. Maybe the person who wrote this just, they have indulged all too often in magical thinking, betting on sanctions, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, or the transfer of new types of weapon to force the Kremlin to come to the negotiating table, or they hope to see Putin overthrown in a palace coup. I'm sure this publication never said any of this stuff. I'm sure that the Wall Street Journal never said any of that stuff was going to happen. And that they've been 100% consistent in being realistic and not engaged in magical thinking this whole time. Okay, let's see here. A policy of containment would mean continuing Western sanctions, isolating Russia diplomatically, preventing the Kremlin from interfering in our own domestic politics, and strengthening NATO deterrence and defense capabilities. I mean, but you already said that the sanctions don't work. You already said that you didn't isolate Russia, that Russia has lots of friends in the world. People like them more than they like you guys. Yeah, so it's this non-answer. I mean, rebuilding the military industrial complex so that you can actually produce weapons again in significant quantities, that is a good idea. That is correct, and that is what they should be doing. But the sanctions they've already admitted didn't work. Europe is, let's see here. NATO's welcomed 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. Putin is reduced to knocking on doors in places like Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. The proverbial correlation of forces has tilted decidedly against Russia. It's against them, guys. It's Russia's losing, but they're not losing. But I get what they're saying. They're saying that they believe in a war against NATO, that Russia would get blown out, which is probably true. I'm not even really going to dispute that. I really doubt that that Russia would be able to take NATO in an all-out war at this point in time. That being said, it's a lot closer than I think it was because a lot of NATO members have basically disarmed themselves because they just have virtually no ammunition or missiles left. So even if they have better weapon systems, I just don't think they have them in enough. Like the UK's army has been reduced to almost nothing. Um, the Eastern European countries have given up all of their Soviet arsenals. Canada's given up most of its weaponry. Germany's given up large numbers of tanks, artillery shells, stuff like that. The US had to borrow shells from South Korea to try to keep this thing going. It's. I'm sure that the US kept like its best weapons for itself, but at the end of the day, you have to have something to fire at your enemies. And if they burn through like their artillery and cluster bombs and they sent a lot of Bradleys and Strikers and Leopards and Abrams and stuff like that over. I don't know. I don't think it's going to come down to a conventional war under any circumstances because both sides have nuclear weapons. And I think for the moment, neither side is insane enough to resort to atomics. I don't think Russia needs to go to war with Europe. I do think it's dangerous the way that like U.S. keeps saying that Russia's going to invade. Now, might Russia try to pull some GSLR ops in Moldova or the Baltic states or something like that and try to get them to leave the EU and join the Eurasian Union or the Union State? That's quite plausible, to be honest. But I just don't see the West being able to rebuild the military-industrial complex in any significant amount of time. And Russia is still expanding its stuff. More important against all predictions, Ukraine has withstood the Russian onslaught. How is it against all predictions? You literally said earlier on that you predicted that the situation was going to go worse for Russia. So it's not against all predictions. It's I don't know, it doesn't make it. It's just countering the other part. In less than 2 years, the Ukrainian army has reduced an entire decade of Russian military modernization to dust. I mean, have they? We're seeing new Russian jets come out, they're producing large numbers of new and upgraded tanks. We have the glide bomb, which has kind of been one of the most interesting weapons of the war. Russia's kind of revolutionized, well, both Russia and Ukraine have revolutionized drone warfare. I don't really think it has. I think it's shown that, well, there's some aspects of conventional warfare that still apply. How important things like precision guided munitions have become. And not so much even just precision guided munitions, but the ability to make massive quantities of them. That industrial warfare is still a thing. But I do think that the tide, at least from what I've been able to determine in this war, has turned against armored vehicles because drones are just too effective at taking them down. Because tanks don't have armor on their roofs. And people made fun of the Russians for putting like spaced armor on the roof of their tanks, and they called them cope cages. If you look at Israeli tanks, they have slat armor on the top of their tanks. It's there to prevent to cause drones to explode before they hit the tank. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's a pretty standard procedure. No less critical is helping Ukraine to navigate towards its rightful place in Europe. So the EU announced that Ukraine has met 90% of the required. Let me find that because that was insane. Okay, so Ukraine has met well over 90% of the necessary reforms the EU set out last year for them to join the EU. What? So they're 90% ready to join the EU. Like, isn't the fact that it's in an active war a condition? Is that one of the 10%? Not being in an active war with a great power? Like, it boggles the mind that they would say that. Also, Moldova and Georgia are also going to join, which I'm pretty sure you can't have ongoing territorial disputes and join the EU. So, how is Georgia going to join the EU? How is Moldova going to join the EU? Also, Moldova and Georgia are like nowhere near developed enough to join the EU. That's not even like a political bias on my point. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. Like, can you imagine if Ukraine did join the EU? Let's pretend that somehow tomorrow they kicked Russia out and they joined the EU. The EU would be on the hook for rebuilding the entirety of Ukraine while it's going through a recession. That's insane. There's no fucking way that's going to happen. Besides, someone's going to veto it. I think actually Germany has said that they're going to veto this. In spite of the invasion, they have come a long way and tried their very best to reform. It's really impressive. Like, if we're going by the G-slur standard of liberal democracy, okay, so if Hungary is a dictatorship according to the EU, if Poland under law and justice was a dictatorship, then Ukraine is a dictatorship. I mean, can we just be honest about that? Like, can we just be real here? I have not seen any real evidence that there's mass electoral fraud in Hungary. It just seems that people like Orban and they like his policies and he keeps winning elections. But like Hungary has nowhere near the level of political oppression against opposition parties that Ukraine does. Has Hungary banned like sects of Christianity? Maybe it has, and I'm just not noticing it. But I'm pretty sure censorship is way worse in Ukraine than it's in Hungary. And people kind of seem to misunderstand me whenever I talk about that. I don't really have an issue with it personally because if you're in a total war, yeah, you should shut down and suppress and take out opposition and sources of domestic um, subversion. But my point is, the whole thing is being sold to us that Ukraine is this liberal democracy that's 90% ready to join the EU and that's completely reformed everything when it's a police state at the moment. And I do think it needs to be a police state. Like, I don't begrudge Lincoln for what he did during the Civil War. If the country is falling apart, then yeah, if there's a time for emergency act, if there's a time to suspend civil rights, total war is probably a good time for that. Like, not like the Patriot Act where like 9/11 was sad and all, but America was in an existential terror. Maintaining cohesion and resolve among the Western allies will be essential for leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, but that's gone because of Israel. Because America will do anything for Israel. America will, like, if America had to spend like 20% of its GDP to prop up Israel, they would. If America had to send like 1 million men to die in Iran because it would slightly improve Israel's position, they would. The American elites are psychotically pro-Israel. For a lot of them, it is a matter of religious faith. Now, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. So to them, like, you have one Jew in Kiev versus 8 million Jews in Jerusalem. So guess who's gonna win? Guess who's gonna get the money? We should be extremely cautious about giving any new leadership in the Kremlin the benefit of the doubt. Reagan needed a lot of convincing that he felt that Gorbachev was different from his Soviet predecessors. The challenge is vastly more difficult, given that whoever might replace Putin would have to end the war and engage with Kiev in genuine, serious negotiations. I mean, they talk about like regime change in Russia. It's quite possible that whoever succeeds Putin will either come from the far right or the far left. Because you have far right nationalists, liberal Democrats, I think Rodina, some other groups. And then you have the far left ultranationalists like the Communist Party. So it probably would come from one of those, or maybe some other hardliner. It's like when we talk about Netanyahu resigning. Netanyahu isn't even on the right wing of his coalition. A lot of the other parties that he's in coalition with are way more radical than Likud is. So just keep that in mind. Well, it depends. Okay, the Communist Party is, I guess, what we'd say maybe on economic issues they are. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is basically a left-wing nationalist party now, in that they tend to be socially conservative, nationalists, but have communist views on economics. So, but my point is, I could see a successor coming from that sort of area, like some sort of left-wing, economically left-wing nationalist. Russia under Putin has mostly a capitalist economy. It's really weird. Okay, so that was the first article that we had in question. Now we're going to look at the second article. So that, I think, was one of the biggest, like I talk about the snake eating as a joke, but I'm just going to ask people in the chat, is that not them throwing Zelensky under the bus? Is that not them like saying that the war is lost, that they're completely fucked, and that there's really nothing they can do at this point in time? Like, what is the conclusion here? Like, they said we need more sanctions, which they admitted didn't work. They need to send more weapons to Ukraine, which they admit they don't have. It's just like, that is a black pill. That is a black pill. We have Pepe Putin here. We have magical thinking. It's rough. So we have a sad, pathetic Zelensky sitting here, with a Z chair, just with nothing. So I don't entirely understand what that is. Happy New Year, the year of our victory, said Zelensky on January 1st, after the liberation of Kharkov and Kherson. Ukrainians entered the ninth year of the war with hope that they could win. Light will always prevail over darkness, Zelensky likes to say. But now the counteroffensive is nearly over, having made crushingly few gains. With Western support waning, Kiev needs to be honest about how the war is going and what it will take to turn the tide. I mean, there's a lot of admissions here. The counteroffensive is near. Well, the counteroffensive is over. They're admitting it didn't make any gains. If you look at the New York Times article, which we looked at previously, that says that Ukraine made some gains. If you look at it, they actually lost territory during the counteroffensive. Kiev needs to be honest about how the war is going and what it will take to turn the tide, but they can't. They can still launch some infantry assaults. They can still take some ground. They can still, there's some stuff that they can do, but they don't have, I don't think they have the strategic initiative anymore. I don't know if we've seen the, let me see if I can find that, because I think they have started sending large numbers of women to the front lines. That could be fake news though, but you know what? Let's take a slight detour. Let's look at a fun story, or a more fun story. For Zelensky, the most popular figure in Ukraine is Zaluzhny, commander-in-chief of the military, and he has a very different message. Fighting has hit a stalemate, he told The Economist. A beautiful breakthrough is not imminent, and Ukraine should prepare for a long trench war requiring huge resources to make small gains. Weapons do arrive, but too few and too late. The long-range missiles and tanks being received now would have been useful last year. When Ukraine innovates, it did it with swarming drones, Russia simply copies, but at scale. Without a game changer, as Zelensky wrote, and without acquiring some new technological advantage, Ukraine won't be able to win. So once again, we have been hearing for like months for this whole conflict that Russia was out of ammunition, Russia was being outproduced, their army was on its last legs, it had no manpower. So it does look like they just lied to everybody. And I mean, you can say what you will about the conflict. I don't care if you're pro Ukraine. I don't if you I don't care if you support Ukraine, if you support Russia, if you support Israel, if you support the United States. The objective fact is that Western governments lied to their population and lied horrendously about how the war was going and led them along the garden path and said everything was good and we have to indefinitely support this war in Ukraine and Ukraine's winning and all this other stuff. And I think regardless of whether you think it was a good idea to fund Ukraine or not, I think the people in the like in Europe and Canada and America deserve to know what was actually happening. And they deserve to like be told this is how the situation is, this is what it's going to cost us. Instead they didn't. Instead they were lied to, they were gaslit, they were told all this stuff, and now it's just dropping on them like a fucking hammer. And when I call this the snake ending, once again, part of it is humor, but another part of it is, yeah, they did promise Zelensky all this stuff. They promised Ukraine all this stuff. They, like, Ukraine was going to basically surrender in February of last year during the Minsk agreement. But Boris Johnson came in and said, no, don't do it. We're going to give you everything. You're going to win the war. So they lied to him, too. So people say politicians lie all the time. But as a man, as a leader, as a prince, all you have is your word. All you have is the trust of the people. And if you're going to just lie like this and lie so flagrantly, then yeah. I'm just going to read that comment quickly. If it wasn't for the laptop class in Toronto, Trudeau would never have become bread lord. But Harper didn't apprentice a new leader to win his final election. Yeah, it's true. Harper did not have a designated successor, which is part of the problem. Now, as I've said, I've moved to Winnipeg, which is cheaper than Toronto, but even here it's starting to get expensive. It's not like it was like a decade or two ago. And grocery prices are astronomical. I was at Dairy Queen the other day because I wanted to try out their sugar cookie blizzard, and like a medium blizzard is now like $8.50 or something like that. Yes, I mentioned I understand that Ukraine got a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper near Kherson. I referenced that a couple times. With this bombshell, he overturned Zelensky's policy of sharing only positive narratives. The Ukrainian president's optimism has always been partly tactical. If the West thinks that Ukraine does not stand a chance, he thinks his allies may push him into peace negotiations. Ukrainians know from bitter experience, including the Minsk agreements, what peace with Russia means. It means Moscow has more time to prepare for the next invasion. I guess, but Ukraine would also have time to prepare. You would also have time to get like the I think like a vanilla dip cone dipped in chocolate is like $6 or $7. It's insane. It's insane. He also emphasized what to do about. Okay. So we also have the sunk cost fallacy that's going on. Sorry, just maybe to address it directly. So Fritz has been saying in the chat that Ukraine got a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper near Kherson. Now, I have heard that, and I am aware of that. And yes, Ukraine has managed to take what appears to be a foothold on the Russian side of the Dnieper. The problem is, I don't think they have the resources to do anything with that. I think they've maybe taken it, they can maybe hold it for a little while, but I don't really know how they're going to expand. And as time goes on, Russia is going to bring more and more troops in. They're going to fire glide bombs. They're going to fire artillery. It's not that hard to take some ground during a war. You have a massive front line, and there's always the opportunity of just running some dudes through open terrain and capturing it. But that's not. I don't think it's sustainable. So, did Ukraine take some territory on the Russian side of the Dnieper? Yes. Are they going to hold it for a while? Probably. Is it going to allow them to do any sort of significant offensive? I don't think so. I also don't know if they can really get armored vehicles across in significant numbers. But Zelensky here has become the victim of the hype over the counteroffensive. Too many people expected a breakthrough when the winter ended and the fighting began. I'm sure the Spectator in no way played into that. I'm sure the Spectator didn't tell people that there was going to be a breakthrough. Like all the Western media said this. All the Western media just said, "Oh, we're gonna break through to Crimea. The Putin regime is gonna collapse." That kind of thing. I could be wrong. Ukraine. This might be a big victory for Ukraine. I'm just being. That's my opinion on the matter. I'm not denying the facts that Ukraine successfully landed on the Russian side of the Dnieper. Okay, so after 5 bloody months of fighting, Ukraine has only advanced 10 miles. Um, so expectations have turned to disillusion, dangerous for a president whose strategy is to keep the dream alive at all costs. Zelensky is dependent on his charisma and his ability to turn a phrase. His much quoted line, "I need ammo, not a ride," stood in the tradition of the finest war leaders and rallied the democratic world to Ukraine's defense. Optimism is one thing, but a refusal to face hard facts is quite another and a dangerous one. Zelensky needs to tell Ukrainians that there is a shortage of soldiers on the front line and that mass conscription is urgently needed. But how can he reconcile this with the official message that victory is just around the corner? Well, he can't. What is emerging between the soldiers on the front line who know how bad things are and civilians in the cities who believe that 700,000 people have been drafted since last February are sufficient to win in some meaningful sense. I spent time on both sides of the divide earlier this year and saw the perception gap myself. The soldiers I talked to in Donetsk region told me that their brigades were so understaffed they were not allowed to go home. Some had been in the battlefield for 18 to 20 months. Others had spent more time at war than at home since 2014. Calling for demobilization after 18 months of service. Like Ukraine's out of manpower. I don't see how that's really arguable anymore. Um, so the front line will need new enforcements, but that will include having a frank conversation with the public about the true state of the war. Also, keep in mind that drafting people doesn't really help in this situation. So they aren't going to have time to adequately train any of these people. They're basically going to take civilian. Now, this is not me talking. Okay, let me see if I can find that. According to the BBC, and this was last year actually. Okay, so things were way worse than even back then. So this is a BBC article, well known to be a far right pro Russia shill publication. Um, tra- Teenagers were given 3 days of training before being sent to the front line. Where is the other one? Uh, Conscripts will get about 17 days of instruction. Okay, that's on the same topic. I do remember though that there was an article. I did cover it a couple days back, a couple videos back, that they had just started throwing in people. Maybe it was that one. Maybe it was from last year. I think there was another one though. But the point is, they're basically, let's see how long U.S. basic training is. Okay, so basic training in the U.S. Army is 2.5 months. And even then, that is, I think that's before they learn some sort of specializations or something like that. Can last anywhere from 4 weeks to 7 months. It depends on what they're doing. Um, that's basic training. I think combat training takes longer. I could be wrong. If somebody knows how long it takes to get a soldier battle ready in the U.S. Army, post in the chat. But the point is, they have nowhere near the amount of time to properly train these dudes, and they're just sending them into the meat grind. It's fucked. Like, it's fucked. I don't know what else to really say about it. It's tragic. Last month, a poll by Kiev Institute of Sociology showed that 80% believe that Ukraine should not give up any of its territories, including Crimea, even if it means to prolong the war. Billboards and TV advertisements beg men to enlist, but why should anyone do so if Russia's defeated? People who think victory is certain want to plan for a future and for their children. They don't risk their lives. They don't want to risk their lives. Excuse me, sorry. So the Ukrainian authorities have two choices. They can keep going with the boosterism and persist in telling everyone the fighting is going according to plan, or they can start an honest conversation about what's actually happening. It's not just the Ukrainian authorities who avoid unpopular topics, but also the Western allies who crave the sight of heroic Ukrainian fighters making stunning advances rather than struggling for every trench. I mean, partially they stopped funding Ukraine because they weren't getting the same degree of media attention. And once again, like, I make fun of this. I call it the Ukraine cinematic universe. I talk about, like, but that's how these assholes view it. That's how these guys view it. Like, they'll tell Zelensky, you have to send your men into battle when they're almost certainly going to get fragged, because it has to make the 9 o'clock news. It's a very sick way of looking at the world. Let's see here. The West needs to be honest with Ukraine too. We in the West became victims of our own propaganda. We thought it would work. We have forgotten about the essence of war. Like, this is devastating. This is them basically admitting it's over. Not necessarily that the war's over. The war, I think, is going to drag on probably until the summer, at least. But it's saying that there's no hope of winning at this point in time. Yeah, the average age of a man in the Ukrainian armed forces is 40 years old. That's way. Although it's kind of funny because I remember there was a World War II documentary I was watching when I was growing up, and somebody said that the minimum age for soldiers should be 40 years old, because by that time in your life, the hormones have calmed down, and older dudes are less likely to go berserk than younger ones. But that's obviously not the case here. I just always thought that was an interesting statement. That was the deal, Kiev. And for Ukraine, Zelensky must talk frankly about the sacrifices that will be required to keep Russian forces at bay for another year. Ukrainians have shown their unity and resilience when they need to defend their homeland. The real question is the extent of the sacrifices everyone is willing to make, and what the most probable outcome will be if they choose not to pay the price anymore. And so the question is, and I did a video on this, and this is an ongoing question, is it honorable to fight to the very end when there's no hope of success?